Okay, so because this test is a little bit different and it's going to be 10 short answer questions, I thought I should put together a little review for you all, just to review some of the important people and important concepts that we covered in this unit. So the first person that we're going to talk about is Ivan Pavlov. So Ivan Pavlov is going to be responsible for classical conditioning. Oops, sorry guys, let me get my pen going here. Okay. So Ivan Pavlov had classical conditioning. And something to remember about classical conditioning is that this is where your body is learning an automatic response. So with Pavlov learned to train his dogs to salivate. And he did this by conditioning. So the first thing that Pavlov did was he took an unconditioned stimulus and paired it with an unconditioned response, which then turned into the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. So for Pavlov, the unconditioned stimulus was the food, and the automatic response that you will have is you're going to salivate. And then if you pair the food with a bell, the dogs will learn to eventually salivate to the bell. And so the bell is actually what we call a neutral stimulus. Okay, second person to know is going to be John Watson. Get this centered a little bit better. There we go. Okay, so here we have John Watson. You would maybe remember him from the 4.4 reading that we just did. And John Watson also did conditioning, but John Watson did conditioning with baby Albert or little Albert. He did what we call fear conditioning. Now with baby Albert or little Albert, what he did was, again, we had the unconditioned stimulus. Sorry. Oh, I can erase. Da 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 da. We'll fix that. Okay, so you have the unconditioned stimulus. And in this case, the unconditioned stimulus is going to be a loud noise that is paired with a white rat. And then you have the unconditioned response, which is fear. You are afraid of that loud noise. Then you eventually learn the conditioned stimulus to be afraid of the white rat. And then your conditioned response is every time you see a white rat, you are afraid. Now, what was interesting about John Watson was what we call generalization. So not only was baby Albert or little Albert afraid of a white rat, but baby Albert was also afraid of anything white and fluffy. So that includes Santa, sorry Santa, bunnies, sorry Easter bunny, anything white and fuzzy. The other ethical issue here is that they never untrained baby Albert, which we now know you can do by pairing that white rat with something positive. Third person to talk about, is going to be Edward Thorndike and law of effect. So Edward Thorndike and law of effect. Edward Thorndike did a lot. Well, really his research helped Skinner. Let's start with that. So his research helped Skinner and operant conditioning. What Thorndike said was that behavior is likely to increase if rewarded. And therefore, it would probably decrease if not. Okay, this is why they say that you should focus on positive reinforcement or focus on some aspect of reward. So if this is true, if law of effect is true, Maddie with sucking her thumb, she's going to be more likely to stop sucking her thumb if she's rewarded. Now, this isn't always true, and we're going to talk about why that might not be true here in a moment. Albert Bandura. So Bandura, we talked about in 4.4. So Bandura is known for observational learning. And the Bobo doll. So essentially what Bandura said is that if you watch someone do it, you are probably going to be more likely to do that yourself. And he did this with Bobo. So took Bobo, had children watch, if they viewed aggression towards Bobo without punishment, they were more likely to show aggression towards Bobo. Now, part of why this happens is because of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons in your frontal lobe, and these neurons are what we believe is responsible for observational learning. That these are the ones that allow you to see a behavior and then mimic that behavior, which would explain a lot for little kids that repeat behaviors without you really teaching them. And then last but not least are schedules of reinforcement. You can find this graph or a similar graph. It's not the exact same graph, but a similar graph in your text. So if you want more resources, it does exist, and I do recommend you taking a look at it. But I did want to take some time to go over this with you really quickly. And in your book, you can find this on page 333. Cool. Okay. I'm sorry, 233, not 333. 233. Okay. What this is showing you. So we know that we have the different responses here, right? We have the fixed, we have variable ratio, and then we have fixed interval and variable interval. So we know that fixed ratio is a fixed number. Variable ratio is a variable number. Fixed interval is time. And variable interval is the change of time, right? So variable means it changes, fixed means stays the same. Okay, so what we found is if you are to give somebody a fixed ratio as far as responding goes, we know that these little dash marks on all of these are going to be the reinforcer, right? So let's say we're talking about pigeons and food, right? So they get food at each one of those little hash marks. So at a fixed number of responses, you get food. What we see happening with that is that you give the response, you get your reward, and then there's a little bit of a break. Like, okay, got my stuff. Now I'm gonna respond again, get my food, take a little break, respond again, so on and so forth. What we see with this kind of a schedule is right here, right? That when you do that, you get a high ratio, meaning that you get more responses, right? So if you do a fixed ratio, what is important about this? Fixed ratio equals high response rate. Okay. Variable ratio. So this means that they're going to give you a reward after an undetermined number of responses. So you're your pigeon, you're pressing the little lever for food, you press, you get a reward. Press, get a reward. And then you have to press for a long time before you get another reward. But what we see happening is that we don't see any pauses. So the pigeons just keep going until they get the reward. Whereas with fixed, they would pause after each reward because they knew another one was coming. So what we find with variable ratio is that you also get a high response rate. Now, if we take a look at time, fixed time, so after a set amount of time, you get a reward. Well, what we see happening here is that people don't really, or pigeons, if we still want to talk about the pigeons, that they go through these long pauses in between because they know they're eventually going to get the reward. So it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do, and then I'm going to pause for a while, and then I get my reward. And then I kind of pause, and then I get my reward, and then I kind of pause, and I get my reward. So you don't get as much of a response as you would to a fixed ratio or a variable ratio. Now, if you do a variable interval, meaning that you get your response or you get your reinforcement after a varied number of time, we find that there really isn't as many pauses though. Because you don't know really when it's coming, that the pigeons would still respond. They're not going to respond as high as they would in the interval, or I'm sorry, they wouldn't respond as high as they would in the ratio, but they're still responding. So there's not as many pauses in between. So what we do know is that fixed ratio and variable ratio are going to give you your highest responses rates, versus the interval versus time. What else we know though is that the two that have the highest to extinction are going to be variable ratio and variable interval are both high or have a higher resistance to extinction, meaning it's harder to get rid of the behavior once that behavior has been established. Okay, so I hope you find this helpful. Again, there's a lot that's happening in this graph, so if you want more, go to page 233 in your textbook.